an external application with Sitecore Content Hub. My name is Akshay Sura. I've been doing Sitecore for quite a bit of time. If you need any help, guidance, or anything in the Sitecore space, especially to do with community, please don't hesitate to reach out. So there's two major ways to integrate an external application with Content Hub, one of them being a REST API. Uh, like other REST APIs, there's no libraries which are needed. They're basically base HTTP calls, which you make to an endpoint to get, put, post information. Again, you can mix and match this to exactly how and what your application needs. And there's no restriction on what you can do. It's almost like having a recipe. So you could either bake a cake with the same recipe or make pancakes or muffins if you choose to. All of these calls can be made over Postman. So if you can make it from Postman, you should be able to make it from any technology which can make a web call. The REST-based API is pretty well documented. The only thing I would say though is once you know a little bit more about using Content Hub and also maybe some training, the documentation would make more sense. But there is documentation available. It's open for you to take a look at. In order to make these calls, you do have to create a couple of things in order to supply the information needed to get the authorization token before you can make these calls. So you go into Content Hub, create a user with appropriate permissions. You also go into Content Hub for OAuth clients, either use an existing client secret and client ID or create a new one. Once you have those pieces of information, you can essentially request an authorization token. And like I mentioned before, you use the authorization token to make subsequent calls for the API. And it's pretty easy. And again, the API is very well documented. The other ways is using the SDK. There's a JavaScript SDK, which I have not played with a lot, but it's essentially you install NPM modules in your JavaScript application. So if it's a React, Angular app, or however you're doing the Jamstack, you should be able to install the NPM module and then make calls appropriately. The other SDK available is the Web Client Sdk. This is the one I use quite a bit. And again, just the statement of it being an SDK, it is an external library you will be pulling into your solution. So via a NuGet package. SDK by definition gives you some pre-built functionality to do things much faster. You don't have to do low-level calls. You don't have to wire up the HTTP client, for instance, and it makes it easier because it's faster. It's almost like a box of cake. You just mix it, throw it in the oven, and you're done. Just like the other piece of documentation, Web Client Sdk is very well documented, so you can go and take a look. The NuGet feed, however, is gated, so you don't need to know where it is. It's not open, but if you go through the training, you will have access to it. So you would just be pulling in a NuGet package into your solution, and then you can get working on it. From a example perspective, I'm not sure how many people have shared their code, but there is a solution for Content Hub, which is public. It's a little bit older, but it kind of gives you an idea of how to do things, and it actually makes it a little bit easier as an example. But the API has been updated quite a bit since then. The latest one was in June, so they do keep it updated. There's also Chris from the community. He has some of his code. He has put it online. Again, his code is mainly run in Visual Studio Code as script files, but it's he creates a couple of products, links them to product families, so it's interesting to look at it. One of the things I want to call out is that even though the Web Client SDK does provide us with existing functionality pre-built, It also lets you make raw API calls, so you don't have to write something separate to make the API calls. It's all part of the same connector, so you do have access to that. In terms of the major entities, so there's several entities in Content Hub. Three of the major ones I would like to call out are m.asset, which is what is used in digital asset management DAM, m.pcm.product, which is used in product content management, and m.content, which is used in the content marketing platform CMP. There's other entities, like I mentioned, so product to product families, or catalogs, or content types, or anything of that sort. I also wanted to quickly go over the entity relationship. So for instance, if you want to relate one entity to another, just like SQL, there's a one-to-one, one-to-many, many-to-many kind of relationships available for you to relate to. And then let's just jump into the demo. So let me get to this real quick. Give me just 1 second. All right, so this is a base plain instance of Content Hub. I'm not sure how many of you have seen this before. You've seen demos, but I don't know how detailed they were. But anyways, since this is like a website SaaS offering, it is a web-based, and every single thing inside of here can be customized to the brand you're serving. So the way it looks, the logos, the colors, the CSS, and every single screen, and what you can do inside of every single screen is all customizable. So as long as you have the access, you can do whatever you need to. In terms of product content management, you have access to creating catalogs. You could create product families, which are basically categories. And then you have products, which you can associate with a catalog and product families. Product by itself, so every single entity can be customized to your heart's content. So I haven't customized these. This is just the base implementation. I just played with it a little bit. Every entity has its own workflow, so you could set up workflows for your asset or product or content. You could customize this the way the UI looks. So if you have multiple panels like this, you could say I could only show this panel if a field value was equals to this. If it's of product type that, show that panel. So there's a lot of conditional logic you could do. You could obviously link a product to assets and different pieces of content. The next section is the DAM. And the DAM is, I think, the most complicated piece in the whole puzzle, just because of the number of things you can do. So imagine an image or a PDF or a video. You could do so much processing. So for instance, if someone uploads an image, you could create several versions of it to fit your different needs, a compressed version, a web version, a social media version, for instance. So there's a lot of image processing you could do. Each of these panels, again, is customizable. You could add custom values. There's some metadata you get in the DAM by default for the file attributes, what can be pulled from the metadata of the file itself. There's digital asset management, which again adds a level of complexity. The next piece is the CMP, so Content Marketing Platform. Essentially lets you define different types of content. So the main content in here is main entity here is m.content, and then you assign a type to it in order for it to be of different content types. So it's almost like templates in a way. So you have a oh, it seems to have internal error. That's awesome. I'll go in here anyway. So this in the management portal, there's quite a few things you could do. The one I wanted to quickly show you is there is content type. So depending on the type, of content, you can define fields. There's two types of fields. One is content fields. Content fields can only be of type text and three different types in now on. But for a detail field, you could have quite a few types of fields. Option lists are basically drop downs, and taxonomies are hierarchical selectors. So if you have more values, but they're in a hierarchical manner, then you can use the taxonomy. You can also link to other content types. So it gets interesting. So when you look at the user group, I have just three fields inside the user group, and it's interesting. It's internal layering out. This is the first time I'm seeing it. But in order for you to see a piece of content, that's actually super odd. This is the first time I'm seeing that. Okay, whatever. Let me see. Since that's giving an error, let's try doing something different. So what I'm going to do is this is a sample app I use in order for me to do testing when it comes to like pushing data and things like that. So what I'm going to try to do is I built a screen to create a user group content type. And let's see if this thing is going to bark at us for that as well. All right. Looks like it did. And then unfortunately, if this doesn't work, then it's going to suck. Oh, there you go. Now it decides to come. I don't know why, but anyways. So um, for a user group piece of content, we just created the sub Pune, and as you can see on the left, we have content fields, and then we can add attachments if we choose to. On the right, we have a little bit more a complicated set of fields, and you could do quite a bit more here as well, like linking to other things. But what's interesting when you're doing the API is that the API is documented, but at the same time, you need to figure out certain things at some time. So one of the best ways for me is looking at it in a raw fashion. So this is the visual representation. This is a raw representation of the same entity. You can see it has an ID, it has an identifier. It seems to have quite a bit of fields. The fields which come inbuilt look pretty. The fields I created don't really have pretty names, but you can see that we stored the user group values in here. And straight off the bat, by looking at the values, I can tell you that they don't have any culture or locale associated with them. So if you have a field type which can store culture-based content, you would see something like this, where you would see the culture and you would see the value for it. In this case, looks like our fields don't have a culture. But you can see different relationships, different things which are part of the metadata. One of the things I can call out is the content to content type. So every piece of content inside of CMP has to have a content type. And you can see that we're relating to a parent of type user group, and this is the ID, and this is the entity. And if you click on this guy, you can see the raw values of the user group itself, the identifier, the ID, and any attributes that specific entity has. Now it's kind of interesting. Let me see if I can go here as well. Second, thought this was running. Oh, I opened it in Chrome. All right, that's fine. Let me open this. So this is something which I wrote the other day. An ASP.NET Core web app does not have a lot of code in it. All it's doing is it's calling the API and it's pulling a list of all user groups. Nothing complicated. It's super simple. But it's other than using the API, it's really not doing anything else. So if you look at the code here, the view is pretty simple. Again, nothing complicated. From a controller perspective, essentially we're just connecting to Content Hub, running a query to get everything which is of type m.content. seeing if we have results. If we do, we're getting every single piece of content, making sure that their relationship, their parent is content type of user group. And if so, we add it to the model and then pass the model back. So that's kind of easy. It's really not that difficult. From what this form was doing, essentially, this is basically a .NET Core app, which is running locally. It doesn't do anything to do with Content Hub. It's essentially adding a value into an Azure function. I'll tell you why I tend to use Azure functions over running it locally. But if we go through it, so the format's a JSON value inside of the queue triggers, and this is what happens. We are connecting to Content Hub, and all of these constants you see are basically name values of things. So if you look at it, the definition for product is m.product. The definition for blog is m.blog. Content type.blog. The user group we are interested in has a different definition. Each field has its own name as to what the field names are. So when I'm using all of these in here, it's essentially just, instead of hard coding it, I have it in a constants file. So we are connecting to Content Hub, and then we are impersonating a user. The reason why we impersonate a user is because any piece of content we're trying to automatically create, we want it to follow the workflow of the user we are creating it under. So if we're creating it as a super user, we don't want it to bypass some of these checks and balances. And once that happens, we are creating an entity of type m.content, specifying the values. And again, because our attributes are not culture specific, we're not specifying a culture for the property, set property. But if they are culture specific and you try to do this, it's going to throw an error saying I can't store it. So you would have to specify culture. Here we are trying to associate the entity we just created with a content type, with a parent to child relationship one-to-one. Same thing here, parent to child with the in progress life cycle. But here we're trying to create a approved for creation status. But if you notice, the relationship here is one to many, so parent to children. So you might encounter different types, and looking at the raw values, it kind of gives you an idea of what it is. So you could fill out the page on Content Hub, save the entity, and then look at the raw value to figure out how the relationships work. And then after that, we just save the entity. And because the entity does not have any errors, it saves it and it gets added. Now, coming back to why I like Azure Functions, this is some of my code for creating assets. So the only way to associate a file with an asset from an API perspective is via a public URL. And where that comes into play is, you go through the same process of creating the asset, specifying all the values for the metadata, but then at the end, you have to specify where to get the actual file from. And imagine you pushing about 20 to 30,000 items up to Content Hub to be created and to pull all these different public URLs for the assets, right? So if you have a PDF, which is 30 or 40 meg, and then you have JPEGs, which are smaller, bigger, then you have videos, which are a couple of hundred meg. When you're trying to you give these URLs, you have to basically create a fetch job inside of Content Hub. So essentially saying, hey, I created this asset, but in order to get the file, go use this public URL and associate that file with the asset, right? So when you create that fetch job, you're just sitting and waiting for it to finish. And imagine you're waiting for like 1,000 of these items. Some of them finish faster, some of them finish slower just because of the size. You have to just keep checking if the fetch job is done. And then once the fetch job is done, that's when you get the actual public link. So there's a lot of waiting for different times, for different amount of time. So I kind of find that it's more stable on an Azure function or functions so that the work gets done rather than a local machine where you're running multiple threads and you have other things to do, and it just makes life easier. So I tend to use it mainly for that specific purpose. And again, the code is pretty simple. And then in the M connector class, which you saw for me connecting, all it's doing is taking attributes and connecting to authenticating to Content Hub. Other than that, there's nothing in that class at all. So it just is super simple. Same thing, same concept goes for product asset and any other type of entity you would deal with. You just have to make sure you know the definition name, create it, assign attributes, make sure that you've assigned the values for all the mandatory or required attributes which are defined for that particular entity, and then you basically say that you're done and you save that. With that, almost towards the end, wanted to mention that we're running a couple of webinars in October, mainly to deal with the first one is the Supercharge Your Product Strategy, dealing with thousands of products and assets and what kind of strategy you need in place, going through use cases and how Content Hub solves the problem. The second one, which is also a little bit interesting, is goes through the whole life cycle of considering Content Hub. What are the criteria when you do get it? What's the process? What do you have to go through? The migration strategy and things of that sort. So we're basically running it in both APAC as well as North America regions. So you could go to conobos.com/webinars to sign up. There's also another piece to this puzzle, which I didn't capture in this one. I'm doing a talk in Symposium with Sumit, which basically talks about the CMP connector. So there are currently two connectors from Content Hub into Sitecore CMS, one for DAM, one for CMP. One of the things people always forget is look at content from anything other than a web perspective, which seems to be a little bit difficult. But once people put their mind to it, it becomes apparent. Is content you're building is not just for the web channel. It could be for your intranet, it could be for social, it could be for syndicated content on a third-party site. So the same piece of content can be used in different channels in different ways. And that's something which is really important to remember. But if CMS is your web channel, which is Sitecore, then there is a connector which helps you sync all the CMP content with your Sitecore XP. So this is a good talk if you guys are attending Symposium, and it talks about the current features and the future features. So if any of you are interested, you could definitely join that. And again, I should be reachable on every public channel you possibly can in the Sitecore community space. So if you need any help, guidance, just want to run things by, or anything, just let me know. I'll be more than happy to help. And again, we have our LinkedIn, Twitter, YouTube. If you want to follow, we typically post quite a few blog posts on anything we work on. So with that, I will pause and I will take any questions you guys have.
Akshay, Rohan, yes. So I had one question. So considering that we already have assets, okay, for an intranet site, and we are using the web API, maybe that the party using the Azure functions we have created. But the problem comes when we want to expose it. Let's say it is an intranet access assets, and we don't want to expose it to a public URL. In that case, how this integration can work?
So at this moment, it doesn't, out of the box, it doesn't give you that ability where you can only access it if with authentication. So it is a public link. It will be public. If you don't post it anywhere, then no one's going to know. But if you do post it, that will be accessible by anyone, right? So there is, out of the box, there's no way to currently do that. But you could add customization, so it is extensible. You could write scripts on the Content Hub end and probably extend that to maybe look for a key or look for something which is coming through the URL in order for you to restrict it. But the current way it works is if the asset is public, it's public.
Okay. So adding a temporary public URL can help this migration, right?
Yes, yeah.
Uh, thanks.
Any other questions, guys? No?
Akshay, just a quick question.
Sure.
This can be integrated for Sitecore Commerce also, right? Like for product import and all.
You
So,
could, there is no connector for it. I believe in 10 they gave some sample code. I have not looked at it personally, but you could pretty much integrate this with anything you want. But in the Sitecore space, yes, it would make sense for us to pull the PCM product into Commerce to enhance the data for a product, yes.
okay.